This is a hint for filling out the unit circle. This is specifically for step 3. This is kind of a way that you can go through and fill out all of the angles without having to have each individual thing memorized. So the hint is that you're always going to start at 0. And then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through all of the angles counting by 30 degrees. So we would go 30 degrees, then 60, then 90, then 120, all the way around till we get to 360. But instead of remembering what each individual angle is in radians, you can kind of use this trick. So we're going to go by pi over 6. So we're going to do 0, then it's going to be 1 pi over 6, then 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, and we're going to keep counting until we get to 12. So now I'm at 6 pi over 6, and then 7 pi, 8 pi, 9, 10, 11, and then 12 is already typed there for you. Now these are not the final answers that you're going to leave because some of them can be reduced. So what I'm going to do now underneath the purple ones is write in blue what they are as their reduced fractions. So pi over 6, 1 pi over 6 doesn't reduce. That stays the same. 2 pi over 6 does reduce. We can divide the 2 and the 6 both by 2, and it would turn into pi over 3. And then same thing here with 3 pi over 6. They're both divisible by 3. So this would turn into 1/2, or pi over 2. 4 and 6 are both divisible by 2, so this would turn into 2 pi over 3. 5 and 6 don't reduce, so this one's going to stay 5 pi over 6. 6 pi over 6 reduces just to pi. 7 pi over 6 doesn't reduce. 8 and 6 are both divisible by 2, so that would turn into 4 pi over 3. 9 and 6 are both divisible by 3, so this would be 3 pi over 2. 10 and 6 are both divisible by 2, so that's 5 pi over 3. And then 11 pi over 6 doesn't reduce, so we're going to leave it as 11 pi over 6. And then 12 pi over 6, the 12 and the 6 divide and give you 2. So these blue things are what you're actually going to write on the unit circle, but you can use what I wrote in purple to kind of get you there. After we go around and do all the angles by 30s or by pi over 6s, we're going to go through and do the exact same thing, but we're going to go to all the 45-degree angles. So we're going to go by pi over 4. So we're going to do the same exact process. So you always start at 0, and then you do 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi, and we're just going to keep counting until we get to 8 pi over 4. All right, so now we're going to reduce like we did for the first chart. So 1 pi over 4 doesn't reduce, so it stays as is. 2 over 4 reduces to pi over 2. And you might notice that we have pi over 2 here, and that's the same exact angle. They are going to overlap, but it's easier to see that some of them overlap than worry about which ones you have to skip. All right, so let's go back and talk about 3 pi over 4, which does not reduce. 4 pi over 4 just turns into pi. 5 pi over 4 doesn't reduce. 6 pi over 4, we could divide everything by 2, so it turns into 3 pi over 2. 7 pi over 4 doesn't reduce, and then 8 over 4 is 2, so that's what you get your 2 pi. So like I said before, you're going to have some overlaps. So pi is going to overlap, 2 pi is going to overlap, 3 pi over 2 is going to overlap. So the ones that are overlapping are your quadrantal angles, so the ones that are on the x and y axes. But it's kind of nice to, when you get to those, to kind of double check that you did it correctly the first time around. We talked a lot about special right triangles in the unit circle. So what I want to do is just remind you of what all of them are and how you get your different sides. So this first one here, we're going to do this as a 30, 60, 90 triangle. So in the unit circle, remember that your hypotenuse of the triangle, which will be the radius of the circle, is always equal to 1. Across from the 30-degree angle is always going to be 1/2. And across from the 60-degree angle will always be the square root of 3 over 2. Now we're going to do the exact same triangle. It's still going to be a 30, 60, 90 triangle, but now the 60-degree angle is going to be in the bottom left corner, and the 30-degree angle will be in the top. So it's the exact same triangle. Hypotenuse is still going to be 1, but now the 1/2 is going to be at the bottom of your triangle because it's across from the 30-degree angle, and then square root of 3 over 2 is going to be on the side of your triangle because now that's across from the 60. The last thing we have to talk about is the 45, 45, 90 triangle. This one's a little easier to remember because both of the legs have the same length. So as always, the hypotenuse is 1, and then each side is going to be the square root of 2 over 2. So one thing I want to point out that might make your life a little bit easier is regardless of what kind of triangle you have, the two legs of your triangle will always be fractions, and the denominator of those fractions will always be 2. So you know that anytime that we're talking about a special right triangle, your denominator is going to be 2, and then you just have to remember what numerator goes with the angle that it's across from. Step 1 to fill in the unit circle is to fill out all of the angles in degrees and radians and the coordinates that are on the x and y axis. So those are our quadrantal angles. So I'm going to do that first. This would be 0 degrees, 90, 180 degrees, 270, and then 360 degrees. Now I'm going to go through and do that whole thing again with radians, and these are ones that you hopefully have memorized. 0 degrees and 0 radians are the same. 90 is pi over 2. 180 is just plain pi. 270 is 3 pi over 2. And then 360 is equivalent to 2 pi. Now the last thing we're going to do in step 1 is fill out the ordered pairs at those quadrantal angles. Remember that we're in the unit circle, so r is always equal to 1. So that means that all of these points are 1 unit away from the origin. So since this first point at 0 degrees is 1 unit to the right, it's going to be the point 1, 0. At 90 degrees, we're 1 unit up, so it's going to be 0, 1. At 180 degrees, we're 1 to the left, so we'll do negative 1, 0. And then at 270, it'll be 0, negative 1 because we're 1 unit down. So that takes care of step 1. Now we're going to fill in all of our degree angle measures, first in 30-degree increments, then 45. So that would be step 2. So for step 2, I already have my 0 degrees in there. And then I'm going to go to 30 degrees, and now I'm just going to keep adding 30s until I get all the way around. There are going to be a few that are left blank. They're going to be the ones that are directly in the middle of each quadrant, and I'm putting like a little blue mark on each of those. We're going to skip over those, and we'll come back to those when we do our 45-degree increments. So I started with 30. If I add 30, that would give me 60. If I added 30 again, it would give me 90, which is already there, so I don't have to write it again. Then I would have 120, then 150, then 180, which is already there. Then I'll go to 210, 240. That brings me to 270, which is already there. And then my last few would be 300 and 330 because 360 is already there. So I've gone through and I've done all of my angles in degrees by 30s. Now I have to do it by 45. So this is where I'm going to fill in those missing angles. So my first quadrant is going to be 45. Now I'm just going to keep adding 45s. If I added 45 to 45, that gets me up to 90 again, which is already there. If I added 45 again, it brings me to 135. If you add 45 again, we're at 180. Add it again, and we're at 225. Add it again, and we're down to 270. And then for our last one, if we add it one more time, that gets us to 315. That takes care of step 2. Now we have to go through, and for step 3, we're going to fill in all of the radian angle measures. And this is where that hint comes in. That was the first thing that we talked about on these notes. So it was those 2 charts where we're going to fill in all of our radian measures. So let's go through and do that. Now again, we're going by 30s, which officially is by pi over 6s. So what we're going to do is we're going to take pi over 6, and we're going to put a number in front of pi. And we're going to start at 1 and work our way all the way around. And we may have to reduce some of them. So I'm not going to show my work. If you're interested in knowing how those got reduced, you should go back a couple slides and watch the step 3 hint slide. So my first 30-degree angle is 1 pi over 6. That doesn't reduce. 2 pi over 6 reduces to pi over 3. 3 pi over 6 reduces to pi over 2, which is already here in red. Then I would have 4 pi over 6, which reduces to 2 pi over 3. Then 5 pi over 6, which does not reduce. 6 pi over 6 reduces to pi, which is already there in red. Then I would have 7 pi over 6, which does not reduce. 8 pi over 6 reduces to 4 pi over 3. 9 pi over 6 is already here as 3 pi over 2. 10 pi over 6 reduces to 5 pi over 3. And then our last one would be 11 pi over 6, because 12 pi over 6 reduces to 2 pi. That's already there. So we're done with our pi over 6 increments. Now we have to go and do our pi over 4 increments. And remember, pi over 4 is the same as 45 degrees. So we're going to do the same thing where we're going to start with 1 pi over 4, and we're just going to keep adding numbers in front and reducing if we have to. And there's going to be a lot of overlap on this one. So you'll see that we really don't have to fill in very many. So my first blank is going to be 1 pi over 4. 2 pi over 4 is already here, which is pi over 2. Then I'm going to have 3 pi over 4, which does not reduce. 4 pi over 4 is already here as pi. 5 pi over 4 would be my next blank. 6 pi over 4 is already here as 3 pi over 2. 7 pi over 4 is the last thing I have to fill in, because then 8 pi over 4 reduces to 2 pi, which is already here. All right, so I've got all of my angles filled in. Step 4 is we're going to figure out in which quadrants are things positive and negative. So I'm going to go through and do that. You see that there are like little positive and negative words in each quadrant. So in quadrant 1, we're going to list out everything that's positive. And the things that are positive is everything. So I'm going to list out sine, cosecant, cosine, and secant, and then also tangent and cotangent. And the things that are negative is none. Everything's positive, so nothing is negative. In quadrant 2, and let me write this down here just to refresh your memory. In quadrant 2, there's an S. S stands for sine, so that means sine is positive, and also sine's partner, which is cosecant. And then the other 4 would be negative in that quadrant. So that would be cosine and secant, and then also tangent and cotangent. Now we're going to go to quadrant 3. In quadrant 3, we have a T. That stands for tangent. So I'm going to put that tangent and cotangent are positive, and then the other 4 would be negative. So that's sine, cosecant, cosine, and secant. And then last but not least, quadrant 4, we have a C. C stands for cosine. So cosine and secant are both positive, and then the other 4 are negative. So that means sine, cosecant, tangent, and cotangent. So we have those all filled out. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to fill out our coordinate points using 30, 60, 90, and 45, 45, 90 triangles just for the first quadrant. And this is, you had another hint, and that was down, it was called the step 5 hint, it was the previous slide. So if you're not too familiar with your sides of your special right triangles, maybe go back and take a look at that. What I'm going to attempt to do is kind of draw in those triangles one at a time so you can really see what we're talking about. So the first thing I'm going to do is focus in on this first point right here. So what I'm going to do is turn this into a triangle. So this green triangle here, I just made it into a right triangle, and because I made it at the 30-degree mark, this makes this a 30-degree angle, which makes this top angle 60 degrees. So what I'm going to do now is fill in the sides of my triangle. We always know that our radius, or the hypotenuse of the triangle, is 1. Across from the 30-degree angle is 1/2, and across from the 60-degree angle is the square root of 3 over 2. So because I know that in the unit circle, every ordered pair is going to be a cosine value, comma, a sine value, which really means we're really talking about our x and our y. I'm going to label these x and y, and then I'm going to fill in my ordered pair. So I'm going to say that my x value is the square root of 3 over 2, and my y value is 1/2. So that is how you figure out that particular ordered pair. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a 45, 45, 90 triangle. So I'm going to erase all the stuff that I had in green here so that I can draw a new triangle. And we're going to do the same process, but with the new triangle. So now I'm going to do this. I'm going to follow the 45-degree line, Draw my right triangle. This would be my right angle. So now my angle right here is 45 degrees, which means this angle up here is also 45. Now, again, this is something you should have memorized. Hypotenuse is always 1, and in a 45, 45, 90 triangle, the sides of our triangle are both square root of 2 over 2. And by sides, I mean the legs of our triangle. So again, this is our x value and our y value. So this ordered pair is going to be the square root of 2 over 2, comma, square root of 2 over 2. We're going to do this process one more time. And this time I'm going to draw the triangle looking at the 60-degree angle. So now I'm going to follow the 60-degree side. I'm going to make my right triangle. So now this angle right here is 60 degrees, which makes this angle up here 30 degrees. And now it's the exact same triangle that we talked about before, but it's kind of switched around. So now my x coordinate, which is down here, is across from the 30-degree angle, so that's 1/2. And then the y coordinate across from the 60-degree angle is the square root of 3 over 2, and of course hypotenuse is 1. So this ordered pair is 1/2 and then square root of 3 over 2. Everything is positive because we're in quadrant 1, so I didn't have to worry about any negatives, and that is kind of reinforced by this up here where it's talking about what's positive and what's negative. So I have all of my coordinates, and you'll notice that the 30-degree coordinate and the 60-degree coordinate are the exact same thing. They're just flipped. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is the last step, which is to copy all the coordinates to the other quadrants, and we have to just be really careful that we're changing the signs. So we have to make sure that we're being symmetric. So everything that should have the same reference angle should have the same coordinates. So what I'm going to do is highlight some of these so it's hopefully very clear to see which ones are the same. So this point right here would have a 30-degree reference angle. So with this point, and this point. So all of those things that I just highlighted in yellow are going to have the exact same ordered pair. The only difference will be the signs. And I'm actually going to go through and do all the signs at the end. So for right now, let's just copy down our coordinates. So this is going to be the square root of 3 over 2 and 1/2, square root of 3 over 2, 1/2, square root of 3 over 2, 1/2. All right, so let's go through and figure out which other ones would be symmetric. So I would have this ordered pair. Oops, I want to choose a different color. This ordered pair, this one, this one. These all have 45-degree reference angles. So this one is going to be square root of 2 over 2 twice. Same with this one. And then same with this one. All right, now last but not least, we're going to talk about the ones that are left over. That one is going to be hard to see now because I went over it with green. Okay, so let me fix this one so we can actually see it. So this is 1/2 and then square root of 3 over 2. All right, so this one I'm going to copy down to all of the other points that I highlighted in blue. And these are the same because they all have a 60-degree reference angle. 1/2 square root of 3 over 2. 1/2 square root of 3 over 2. Okay, so let's go back and talk about signs. In quadrant 1, everything is positive. In quadrant 2, in order to get to our points, we'd be going left and up. So that means our x values are all going to be negative, and our y values will all be positive. In quadrant 3, we'd be going left and down to get to our points. Those are both negative directions. So that means both of our coordinates for each point should be negative. And then in quadrant 4, we'd be going right and down to get to our ordered pair. That means our x value is positive, but our y values are all negative. So this is the complete filled in version of the unit circle. This has taken us about 13.5 minutes. This will not take you that long once you get good at it. It took us a long time because I was going through and explaining everything, but you should be able to do this with practice. You should be able to do this in less than 5 minutes.